In recent years, California has taken significant steps to address the news crisis. Last year, the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism launched a $25 million state-funded fellowship program aimed at supporting local reporting in underserved and historically underrepresented areas across the state. We learned about this initiative on this very stage last year. That $25 million is the largest state allocation ever made in the United States to support local journalism, and we can thank our next speaker, Senator Steve Glazer, for securing that funding. Since then, Senator Glazer has been a leader in Sacramento in pressing for far greater resources for journalism in legislation designed to make tech giants like Google and Meta pay for the impact they are having on our personal data and the information we receive through their platforms. Over the summer, the California Senate passed legislation SB 1327 that would have provided $500 million in annual funding for local journalism jobs. At the same time, similar legislation was introduced in the California Assembly by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks to tax tech companies for using and selling advertising alongside news products produced in California. But Google fought back. In the spring, it announced it was limiting search results from California news sites and said it would stop planned investments in news until, quote, there's clarity on California's regulatory environment. In the end, both bills were scuttled in favor of a negotiated settlement between Google, Wicks, and California Governor Gavin Newsom to create a much smaller fund with contributions from state government in addition to new and existing payments from Google to support California news outlets. The final details of the deal still need to be finalized, but it appears that the funding will include $70 million in state funding, with $30 million flowing in the first year and another $10 million annually for the remaining 4 years. Google would be expected to provide $110 million for journalism and an additional $12.5 million annually for research on artificial intelligence. We have the wonderful opportunity today to hear what's next from Senator Glazer, who will be joined in conversation with Lenny Mendonca, a member of the board of Rebuild Local News, who is also former Chief Economic and Business Advisor to Governor Newsom and Chair of the Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you. That's a nice introduction. Yeah.
We have props, so. Thank you, Casey, and thank you, Senator Glazer, for joining us on this important topic.
You're welcome.
We have a short time, so I'm going to dive right into it.
Yeah.
Before we get into the specific things that happened in the last year, I'd like to ask you a little bit about why do you care about this issue? And then also tell me, what is your view of the impact of the local journalism fellows that you helped champion?
Well, first, so nice to be here. I'm honored to be here. The work that you all do is so important and impactful to saving our democracy. And I just am so blessed to be in this group. So I thank you all for all that you are doing. And you know, my interest, Lenny, is not any different than any citizen would in terms of loving our democracy, appreciating it, not taking it for granted, and also seeing the threats that are out there. And I've been in public life for 40 plus years. And obviously had a vantage point to see the threats. And then that question is, what are you going to do about it? It's a big issue. It's not an issue that's necessarily constituent driven. So you have to think beyond your own self-interest of making your district happy. In the Senate, we represent about 1 million people. And so you have to kind of get out of that space, and I was able to do that, and that's why I care about it and why I've engaged.
And so the fellows that have been out there now, how many of them, how are they doing?
There's 80 of them out there now, 80 young professionals fully paid in 80 outlets throughout California now doing great journalism. And by the way, that program, that $25 million program, was actually opposed by the California Newspaper Publishers Association. And maybe that will come out in our conversation, that this ecosystem is dysfunctional in a lot of ways, including actually opposing this incredibly wonderful program that is going on right now in our state.
Well, in full disclosure, at the Half Moon Bay Review, we're the beneficiary of one of those fellows, and he's, Sebastian is his name, and he's been a huge success. Was going to leave the profession but for that fellowship.
Right.
And his first week had a lead story in our newspaper on farm workers, and has done work with KQED, and it wouldn't have happened without that, so thank you.
Right. There is a handout for folks in terms of seeing what that program's doing that's available, just so you can pick that up on the way out.
Okay, so let's go into the last legislative cycle. So how in the world were you able to get 2/3 of your colleagues to support something as bold as what you proposed?
Well, I think on one hand, people are seeing the same things that we are all seeing, the hollowing out of journalism across the state. And obviously we wanted to tell that story of how the digital advertising has gone off the charts at the same time that newspaper advertising has sunk to record levels. There's a chart here that shows that the blue line is newspaper advertising over the last 30, 40 years, and the green line here is internet. So it gave me the opportunity to tell that story and see if there was some grip among my colleagues to be willing to get in the space and try to solve it. I got support from the leader of the Senate, Mike McGuire, and relationships. I'm in my 10th year in the Senate, and those things all come into play. We got a 2/3 vote, including Republicans, so it was bipartisan to move this bill. And I think it was part of the introduction today. You know, $500 million annually every year into journalism in California, mostly in the form of a tax credit for employed journalists.
And so what were the arguments that convinced people that would not normally be engaged in something like this, not just Republicans, but, you know, skeptical Democrats, people who don't want to have taxes, you know, what convinced them?
Well, there were a number of hurdles that we had to get over. One was nobody wants government interfering in the news business. And as much as, you know, you'd like to get stories that are positive about you, if you're focused on democracy, you know that's not a good thing. So part of it was, how do you take money generated from government, even if it wasn't government money, ensure that it was going to be spent in a way that didn't have government influence. And we had a hearing on the subject. I chaired the Revenue and Taxation Committee in the Senate. We had a hearing where we brought in experts, lawyers, and the rest to talk about if we had a pot of money, how would it go out in a way that was neutral, that was not influencing. And the tax credit was the one that people rallied around, and people could see that in California we give tax credits for other things, including for the film industry, right. And we're not dictating what kind of films are made. So we have some precedent here about how to do it, and I think that overcame some of the reluctance. But by the way, and I mentioned this earlier, the news media themselves weren't happy with my bill. They wanted a link tax. That was another proposal that you saw out of Canada that was in play. And so we had there was equal skepticism among the news community, believe it or not, in a proposal to generate $500 million a year to them than there was among my colleagues in the legislature, as crazy as that sounds.
And so why was that?
Selfishness. That they weren't focused on the ecosystem of journalism and the democracy that we're trying to solve for. They were interested in their own little fiefdom, and a lot of the biggest ones that remain really wanted government to create pressure on the platform so that it would leverage their own side deals, which is kind of what happened in Canada. That's really what many of them wanted, and this is the big ones. They cared nothing or very little about nonprofit, about community, about ethnic. It was just about them. And at the end of the day, this side deal that was mentioned earlier, which I thought was a very bad deal and I opposed it, it completely cut out broadcast. I mean, there's not even any money there for broadcast. And even the amount of money that's in this deal is peanuts. If we're really going to stop this deterioration of news media in California, let alone across the country.
So take us through, for people who are not experts at the California legislative process, take us through what happened. You mentioned there was another bill, your bill passed the Senate, so what happened?
Well, let me at least, for people who don't know, we've been able to follow, as many here, governmental actions across the world, whether it was in Australia or Canada. Maryland passed an ad tax. So we've been able to watch the whole, all the maneuvering in the space. Meta saying, if you're going to create an obligation of finance, we're going to pull out completely, as they did in Canada. Amazon, which walks away because they're never touched by any of these actions, the legal lawsuits in Maryland on the ad tax. So anyway, so we've been able to look at all that, and what I tried to do in the legislation in California that can maneuver around all the different rules and regulations of the United States was to create a two-part requirement to be subject to this ad sales and use tax. One is you had to extract data from Californians without paying for it. That was requirement number one. And that's the type of thing that you all are very familiar with. You go on social media, you buy things, they now know everything about you. They've extracted your data, and they didn't pay you for it, and yet that is what has allowed them to hollow out the newsrooms on advertising because they can personalize it so effectively. So the first requirement of my bill was to extracting data and not paying for it. And the second is you had to use that data to advertise in California in excess of $2.5 billion. And that affected 3 companies. And that generates $1 billion a year to California. And as we pay for our school obligations, it flows down to $500 million into the newsrooms. So that was the proposal that we put forward. That was different than the link tax, which Amazon isn't touched by. Meta gets out of it by saying we weren't going to do it. And Google can maneuver around it, including potentially with artificial intelligence as local news gathering. And that's what we put forward to try to maneuver through the legal morass and get something that, the problem with it, though, is it needed a 2/3 vote. But then I got it in the Senate. And that created a lot of stress. And that's why this deal that was cut was basically a Google deal. This is the deal they did to stop a bigger threat, which was my bill, number one. And number two, a precedent that they were most concerned about. It wasn't just that they had to pay in California, but they wanted a deal here that couldn't be replicated in any other state. So they couldn't go to the red states and say, the government has to put money in. They're going to say, no, we'll regulate technology, but we don't want to put any money in. So that takes away that vulnerability. And in some of the other states, there was a package that was going to make it harder for them to follow, because they don't feel that obligation that we feel that they should own up to and pay for in supporting our democracy.
And so, in the end, this was a deal that was negotiated individually with Google in exchange for pulling the Assembly bill, but
killing both bills, both my bill, then did not get a hearing in the Assembly, and her bill, which was on the floor of the Senate, ready to go.
Okay. So what have you learned from what happened?
Well, the threat hasn't changed. Everyone here knows it. The question is really, what can we do in a material way, not a token way, about it? And obviously, philanthropy is a big help, and thank you to everyone here who's involved in that space. But you only have 2 other options. You can have government providing the money, and that's problematic given budgets around the country, but it's still an option. Or you can take who caused this problem and put an obligation on them, where I think that is the pathway. And this side deal that was cut takes some of the pressure off of Google, Amazon, and Meta, but I think it should be rejoined. And I think it's when you think about how each of us can make an impact in news, revitalizing local news, and philanthropy is an important place, it also means maybe we should look at how we can influence the governmental process to have the obligation on these platforms be realized. All these platforms, they lobbied up, they lawyered up, they've spent millions trying to defeat these bills. If you're not from California, you didn't see the ads that they got to run, some at very low cost on their platforms and elsewhere. But they can be defeated if we get organized around it. But here's the thing, the news ecosystem split. By the way, the Berkeley Fellowship, there was opposition, but they're happy to get those fellows. But we have to rethink how news can function independently and effectively and yet have a government connection. Most people don't know, and Steve Waldman, who I know has participated in your seminars in the past from Rebuild Local News, he's written about how government of the United States used to invest in news, independent news, because they subsidized the postal rates, and that has kind of gone away. But it's not like crazy anti-American to have government involved in sustaining news that sustains our democracy. So we have to rethink that, and that's on a state level, that's a federal level, that's engaging the President of the United States in that space. But we have to fight. We have to fight at every level. And I think that's what I think hope comes out of the success we had in California. We didn't get it across the finish line, but we can. And let me show one more chart here, which I think is informative, in that space of whether government should be involved in democracy. Here's some of the largest democracies in the world. Look what they provide per capita in spending for news. And then look where we are. So is the BBC biasing and horrible in England? It's government funded. Is that breaking down the wall between government and news gathering? So I think we need our governmental leaders to rethink that and realize that we have to be part of the solution. And if you're not going to do it with government support, well, then let's put the obligation on the folks that have really created the problem. And I think that there is a path there. I like to say, Lenny, in Sacramento, our state capital, we have over 2,000 registered lobbyists, but none of them have democracy on their client list. None of them. And so when we're in these fights, we have to have the news ecosystem together, not fighting with each other, but understanding that we're all in this together, and we need other support out there from communities and companies. Democracy, it's a fragile thing. Everybody knows this. It's not how long it lasts. It's not whether. It's not if it will fail. It's when it will fail. And if you look around the world today, you see how democracies deteriorate in Hungary or in Turkey or in Argentina. You see the breakdown when government leaders take control of their news media. 71% of the world's populations are governed by autocracies. So our democracy is fragile, and we all have to understand, including big companies, American companies, that we all have an investment in maintaining that democracy. How's Facebook doing in Korea, North Korea, or in Russia, or in China? So these platforms have to realize that we're all in this together. We need their help, and they have an obligation that they should step up and fulfill.
Great. So I would bet if you asked the average person whether you would have gotten your bill out of committee, had majority, or even 2/3 support, people would have laughed you off the stage.
In an election year.
In an election year. So, but you did.
We did.
So where do we go from here? Where are there opportunities, either in California, in other states, at the federal level? What would you advise people to do?
I think the more pressures that are placed by other states on these platforms to own up to their responsibility. We came up short in California, but we set, I think, a practice both on how you can do it and that you can get bipartisan support. So energetic efforts in other states, and I know there is some small efforts that are going on that folks here may know about or can be shared. So I think that is something, nobody likes to fight a 50-front war, and these platforms should have to engage in a 50-front war. We certainly need the leader of our country to realize the importance of independent news and how there is a role to play. I hope the New York Times is successful in their antitrust suit. But I don't think we can count on the courts saving us, although a federal court just ruled that Google engaged in monopolistic practices, so there's a little bit of hope there that someone's paying attention. But then we have big states like California where we came up short, but we shouldn't come up short. And we shouldn't try to pretend to solve the problem. This side deal with Google is a pretend. It sounds like a lot of money, folks. It's not, okay? It's peanuts. It's a pretend to get them out of their obligation. And we shouldn't accept that. We need to fight back on that. And we need people to step up leadership roles to fight back.
So I know not everyone in the audience may know, but I know that you've only got a short time before you're termed out in the Senate. But if you were in the Senate or you're talking to your colleagues who care about this issue, what would you tell them about what are the ongoing possibilities in the state of California to address these issues?
Well, 6 weeks and I'm a private citizen again.
Don't look smile that much.
After 10 years in the Senate, I love the work. I'd love to be able to continue the work. It's just not to be with our term limits. But I would say to them, look, it's so easy to have blinders on in these leadership roles and just think about interest groups in power and your constituents and not realize the big picture. Because I do talk about it a lot, that it's not the decision you're making today on this bill or that bill. It's that, are you building trust in our democracy? That's the big question that every member should be thinking about. Are you building trust? Because this is a fragile place. It's not just about getting reelected. And the fight for democracy goes beyond just trust in decisions, but the fact we have the oversight, the independent oversight to keep us accountable for what we do and how we do it and what we say, and whether it's in the public realm or it's in a back room. And so you got to get out of your narrow place that, you know, all of us have been bred in the world of politics to be, it's all about reelect. It's all about reelect, and it's about pleasing power. And you got to step away from that if we're going to save our democracy and build and rebuild that trust that is so important to what we do. So,
well, Senator Glazer, I thank you for all of what you've done and will continue to do to be a rally and a champion for this cause against all odds. And if people want to know more about what you've learned from this, how do they learn more?
So we have a breakout later today. And so the few people that want to engage more deeply, whether it's about the legal issues or the rest, come to the breakout and we can engage in a more serious conversation about it. And I hope to be involved in some way, shape, or form in my private role, because I care deeply about this work, as I know everyone here in the room does as well. And we have to step up more than we thought we needed to because of what's at stake.
Great. Well, thank you, Senator
Lenny.
Glazer.
Thank you, Lenny. Okay.